There are endings written into the fabric of every world, prophecies carved in stone, destinies whispered through generations. The kind of conclusions that feel inevitable, like the last breath of a dying star. This was supposed to be one of those endings. In a realm where magic flowed like blood through ancient veins, where kingdoms rose and fell beneath the weight of their own ambition, a figure stood at the center of apocalypse. Not a hero, not a savior, a tyrant, a conqueror, a force so absolute that entire civilizations had bent their histories around the singular question of how to stop them. They had built empires on the bones of the faithful, shattered gods who dared oppose them, rewritten the laws of reality itself to serve their vision of order. For centuries, they had been the answer to every question mortals feared to ask. What happens when power has no limit? What does ambition look like when it succeeds? And now, at last, the world had gathered its strength for one final rebellion. Heroes stood in the ruins of the tyrant's citadel. Legendary warriors. Mages who had sacrificed their souls for forbidden knowledge. Chosen ones marked by destiny itself. They had climbed through rivers of blood, through layers of betrayal and sacrifice, through trials designed to break the spirit before the body ever fell. And they had won. The tyrant's armies burned across 1,000 battlefields. Their generals lay broken. Their fortresses crumbled into dust. The great ritual that had sustained their immortality unraveled thread by thread, pulled apart by heroes who truly believed that evil could be destroyed if only you were willing to pay the price. The final blow came with all the weight of narrative inevitability. A sword through the heart. A spell that shattered the soul. A prayer answered by gods who had waited lifetimes for this moment. The tyrant fell. The world exhaled. Prophecy at last was fulfilled. But in the space between heartbeats, something changed. Not resurrection. That would have been expected. Tyrants always returned in legends. That was the nature of stories. Evil never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting for the next generation of heroes to prove their worth. This was not that. This was something the prophecies had never prepared for. Reality itself began to tear. Not slowly, not with warning. The air above the tyrant's fallen body split open like flesh beneath a blade, and what poured through was not light or darkness, or any element the world had ever known. It was screaming color. Impossible geometry. The sound of 1 billion voices speaking in languages that should not exist, overlapping until meaning itself collapsed into raw sensation. The heroes staggered back. Their weapons, still wet with the tyrant's blood, suddenly felt meaningless. Small. Like children's toys held before an oncoming storm. The rift expanded. It was not a doorway. Doorways implied destinations. This was a wound in existence, and through it poured something that felt less like a place and more like a state of being. A realm where thought and matter blurred together, where emotion had weight and consciousness had teeth. The tyrant's body broken, defeated, mortal at last began to rise. Not through their own power. They were being pulled, dragged by forces that cared nothing for victory or defeat, for prophecy or justice. The rift wanted them, needed them, claimed them with the inevitability of gravity. The heroes watched, frozen. Some tried to intervene. A final spell. A desperate lunge. Anything to ensure the tyrant stayed dead, stayed defeated, stayed within the boundaries of the story they had spent their lives fighting to complete. But the rift swallowed everything. Magic dissolved before touching it. Blades passed through its edges and came back warped, their metal screaming in frequencies that made ears bleed. And then the tyrant was gone. Pulled into the wound in reality, consumed by the impossible colors, lost to a destiny no prophecy had ever predicted. The rift sealed behind them. Silence returned to the ruined citadel. The heroes stood in the ashes of their victory, and for the first time, they felt something worse than fear. They felt uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of their world, beyond the comfortable rules of magic and destiny and narrative conclusion, the tyrant opened their eyes. They were not dead. They were not alive. They were drifting. The realm around them defied description. It was vast and claustrophobic simultaneously, infinite and suffocating. It pressed against consciousness like water against drowning lungs, but it had no substance. No form. Only presence. Colors that should not exist swirled in patterns that hurt to perceive. Shapes formed and unformed, constantly birthing and dying in cycles too rapid to track. Sounds echoed without source laughter, screaming, whispers, roars, all overlapping into a cacophony that somehow organized itself into something almost like meaning. This was not the afterlife. This was not another world. This was something older, something fundamental. The tyrant had ruled through understanding. They had conquered by seeing the patterns beneath chaos, the structures hidden inside randomness. They had broken heroes by knowing them better than they knew themselves. And now, floating in this impossible realm, they began to understand. This was not chaos they had ruled. This was chaos itself. The distinction mattered. What they had called chaos in their world, the entropy of failing kingdoms, the disorder of collapsing systems, the madness of power unchecked, those were shadows. Metaphors. Pale imitations of something far more fundamental. This was the raw substance of unreality. A dimension where thought became form and emotion had mass. Where belief shaped existence and consciousness itself was a weapon. They had ruled a world. This was a realm that devoured worlds. And somewhere in the infinite screaming darkness of the Immaterium, something ancient and terrible turned its attention toward the new arrival. The warp had claimed another soul, but this soul was not like the others. This soul had worn a crown. The assault began immediately. Not with violence, though violence came but with sensation. The warp pressed against the tyrant's consciousness like a lover and a predator, testing boundaries, searching for weakness, probing for the cracks that existed in every mortal mind. Visions flooded in. Memories of their greatest triumphs twisted into mocking parodies. The faces of everyone they had ever killed returned and screaming. The weight of every betrayal, every calculated cruelty, every moment of absolute power turned into instruments of psychological torture. The warp showed them their empire burning, their name forgotten, their legacy reduced to ash and footnotes in history books written by the heroes who had killed them. It showed them the truth they had always denied, that they had mattered to no one, that their ambition had been empty, that their existence was a cosmic joke told to an audience that had already stopped laughing. For most minds, this would be the end. The human psyche, even the psyche of heroes and champions, was not built to withstand the Immaterium's assault. It was a realm that fed on doubt, that amplified fear, that took the smallest insecurity and expanded it into existential horror. Mortals who entered the warp either broke or burned. The tyrant did neither. They observed. They had ruled through fear, yes, but not blind fear. Calculated fear. The kind that required understanding your subjects better than they understood themselves. You could not dominate minds without first comprehending how minds worked. And the warp, for all its alien horror, operated on principles they recognized. Belief shaped reality here. Emotion had weight. Consciousness was both weapon and vulnerability. These were not foreign concepts. These were the same tools they had used to build empires. The visions continued, but now the tyrant engaged with them differently. When the warp showed them failure, they analyzed the tactical errors that had led to their defeat. When it showed them betrayal, they cataloged the patterns of disloyalty, the psychological profiles of those who turned. When it showed them horror, they studied its structure, its rhythm, its purpose.
The warp was not random. It was reactive. It fed on what you gave it.
And the tyrant, even here, even powerless and drifting in an alien dimension, refused to give it fear. The temperature of the Immaterium around them began to change. Demons noticed. They came slowly at first, minor entities, curiosity-driven things born from the psychic residue of a billion forgotten thoughts. They circled the tyrant's drifting form like carrion birds, sensing something unusual. Something that did not scream, did not beg, did not shatter into madness and meat. A consciousness forged through conquest, tempered by betrayal, sharpened by apocalyptic ambition. The demons drew closer. One lunged, a creature of raw hunger, all teeth and appetite and mindless need. It sought to devour the tyrant's soul, to consume their essence and add it to the screaming mass of the warp's eternal digestion. The tyrant's will struck it like a hammer. Not psychic power, they had no training in the ways of the Immaterium. Not magic, their connection to their world's mystical forces had been severed the moment they were pulled through the rift. Just will. Pure, concentrated, absolute will. The demon recoiled. Its form destabilized, flickering like a candle in a hurricane. It fled back into the deeper currents of the warp, carrying with it a message that rippled through the immaterial realm. This one was not prey. More came. Greater demons this time. Beings of terrible beauty and calculated malice. They did not attack directly. They whispered, promised, tempted. They showed the tyrant visions of power restored, of new empires waiting to be claimed, of a universe so vast and broken that it practically begged for a conqueror's hand. They offered servitude that looked like partnership, chains disguised as crowns. The tyrant listened and refused, not with anger, not with defiance. With the calm certainty of someone who had heard every promise power could make and understood the price beneath the words. They had been offered godhood before, in their own world, had turned down divinity because gods were bound by worship, limited by faith, constrained by the beliefs of their followers. They had not clawed their way to absolute power only to kneel before new masters. The demons withdrew, confused. Frustration rippled through the warp, a disturbance felt across vast psychic distances. And in their impossible thrones beyond mortal comprehension, the chaos gods themselves turned their attention toward the anomaly. Khorne sensed a warrior who fought without rage. Sinchi perceived a mind that schemed without hope. Nurgle observed a will that refused despair. Slaanesh tasted an ambition devoid of pleasure. This was not a champion. This was not a servant. This was something the warp had not encountered in eons. A conqueror who understood that power was not given by gods, it was taken from them. The space around the tyrant began to stabilize. Not through purity or faith, but through sheer force of personality. Their consciousness, refusing to dissolve into the warp's chaos, created a pocket of coherence. A small island of structured thought in an ocean of screaming madness. They floated there, neither dying nor truly living, suspended in a realm that should have consumed them within heartbeats. And they began to learn. The warp was not infinite chaos. It had patterns, currents, rules written in emotion rather than mathematics, but rules nonetheless. Territories claimed by vast intelligences. Hierarchies maintained through dominance and belief. It was, in essence, an empire. Just infinitely larger and more horrifying than any they had ruled before. The tyrant did not smile. Their form in this realm was more concept than flesh, but something like satisfaction rippled through their being. They had been cast into hell. And hell, it turned out, was just another kingdom waiting for a throne. The chaos gods watched. And for the first time in eternities beyond counting, they felt something they had not expected. Not fear, not yet,
but recognition.
The warp had not claimed a victim.
It had gained a rival.
The transition from warp to real space was violent. One moment, the tyrant drifted through impossible dimensions, studying the architecture of chaos. The next, reality seized them with crushing force and spat them into a universe governed by physics that had not bent to conscious thought in millions of years. They materialized in the void.
No ceremony.
No grand arrival. Just existence suddenly reasserting itself with all the grace of a falling stone. Alarms shrieked across Imperial battlements. The system was designated Hydra Prima Fortress World on the edge of a sector perpetually at war with itself. Orcs to the galactic east. A Tau expeditionary force probing from the north. Chaos cults erupting like infected wounds across the southern hive cities. The Imperium's presence here was absolute. Massive orbital platforms. Cathedral ships that doubled as weapons of faith. Entire generations born, lived and died aboard vessels that had not touched planetary soil in centuries. When the warp rift tore open above the third moon, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Defense lasers carved the void into geometric patterns of destruction. Torpedo spreads formed killing fields. Strike craft launched in swarms that blotted out distant stars. But the rift had already closed. And floating in the debris field, surrounded by the wreckage of automated defense drones that had fired on empty space, was a single figure.
Alive.
Conscious. Unprotected by any technology the Imperium recognized.
The first boarding team found them 3 hours later, after scanners finally confirmed biological readings and cogitator priests had completed 17 layers of blessing to ensure their instruments were not possessed. They expected a demon. A Xenos infiltrator.
Perhaps a psyker who had survived the warp through some combination of power and insanity.
What they found was worse. Someone who looked almost human. Almost.
The proportions were slightly wrong in ways that took minutes to identify. The eyes held intelligence that felt both ancient and utterly calm. And when the guardsmen leveled their lasguns and shouted commands in Gothic, the figures simply watched them.
Learning.
The boarding team's lieutenant, a veteran of 30 years' service who had seen horrors that would break civilian minds, felt something he had not experienced since his first combat drop.
Not fear.
Uncertainty. They brought the figure aboard the frigate Unshakable Conviction under enough restraints to bind a Chaos Space Marine.
Psychic suppressors. Null field generators.
Blessed chains inscribed with prayers so old their original meaning had been lost to time.
None of it seemed to matter.
The figure did not resist.
Did not speak. Simply observed everything with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like tactical assessment. The ship's savant attempted classification. Not a psyker the null fields should have caused pain or disorientation, but the figure showed no reaction. Not a demon the blessed chains made contact without burning away. Not a mutant gene scanners returned results that were maddeningly close to human baseline, with variations that made no biological sense. Not Xenos at least, not any Xenos species in the Imperium's extensive databases of things that needed to be exterminated.
The classification came back as an error code the savant had never encountered. Undefined threat category. Which, in the Imperium's binary worldview of loyal or heretic, was perhaps the most dangerous designation possible. The interrogations began in a chamber designed to break wills. Harsh lights.
Sleep deprivation.
Psycho-conditioning techniques developed over 10,000 years of enforcing compliance. Interrogators who could read guilt in a subject's breathing pattern, who knew exactly which questions would crack which personality types. The figure answered their questions calmly. Not evasively. Not with the frantic cooperation of the broken or the sneering defiance of the zealous. With the measured tone of someone participating in an interesting intellectual exercise.
They spoke of empires. of systems of control that spanned worlds, of the mathematics of fear and the architecture of absolute power. They described cycles of decay, how civilizations built on rigid dogma inevitably collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Some of the interrogators felt inspired by the clarity of the analysis. Others felt sick. All felt watched. The figure studied them while being studied, cataloged their body language, noted which questions caused micro-expressions of doubt, identified the hierarchies within the interrogation team without anyone speaking a word about rank. By the third session, they were speaking Gothic fluently. By the fifth, they could identify which interrogator was Militarum, which was Administratum, and which was inquisitorial by nothing more than stance and subtle variations in uniform. By the seventh, they casually referenced the Horus heresy in a context that suggested they understood the Imperium's greatest trauma better than some of the interrogators did. That was when the report was escalated. Not because the figure had done anything overtly threatening, but because they demonstrated something the Imperium had not expected and could not categorize. Competence. Not the competence of a soldier. The Imperium had billions of those. Not the competence of a scholar or a priest or even a planetary governor. The competence of someone who had built and maintained control over populations that numbered in the millions. Who understood the infrastructure of tyranny the way a mechanicus adept understood machinery. Someone who looked at the Imperium and saw not the God Emperor's glorious domain, but a system. One they recognized. One they could diagram, analyze, and most terrifying, potentially improve. Word spread through the frigate's crew. Not officially. The Imperium did not allow rumors, did not permit speculation about matters above one's station. But humans are humans, even when wrapped in ceramite and prayer, and whispers traveled through the ship like infection. Some guardsmen reported dreams where they served a different empire. One that did not pretend its cruelty was holy. One that offered no salvation, but also told no lies about what it demanded. The ship's chaplain increased prayer rotations by 40%. Commissars watched for signs of wavering loyalty with hands never far from bolt pistols. And in the detention cell, surrounded by enough firepower to level a city block, the tyrant sat in meditation. They had learned much already. This universe was not empty. It was crowded with factions, each locked in wars that had lasted longer than their entire civilization. Humanity here was not ascendant but embattled, holding territory through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die. And at the center of it all was something the Imperium called the God Emperor. A being who sat on a throne of suffering, kept alive by sacrifice, worshipped by trillions who had never seen him and never would. A god who, by every account, had once been a man. The tyrant understood immediately. This was not a realm of heroes and villains. This was not a story with a prophesied ending. This was a universe that had already concluded, and it had chosen eternal war over final death. For the first time since arriving, the tyrant felt something like satisfaction. They had been cast into a dying universe. And dying things were always the easiest to control. The Inquisitor arrived with the cold certainty of someone who had spent lifetimes making decisions that would damn millions to save billions. Her name was Covenant. No house name, no honorific, just the title she had earned through 3 centuries of service to the Inquisition's most brutal truths. She wore authority like armor and judgment like a weapon. Behind her came others. Inquisitor Morrigan of the Ordo Hereticus, whose specialty was identifying the corruption that grew in human hearts when faith wavered. Inquisitor Castrel of the Ordo Malleus, who had faced demons that could shatter reality and lived to catalog their weaknesses. They came with revenues, with warriors and savants and mystics, with instruments designed to measure heresy in its earliest stages, to detect the fingerprints of chaos on a soul before that soul even knew it had been touched. They came prepared to execute. Instead, they found themselves debating.
The chamber they requisitioned was deep in the frigate's most secure section. Nullfield generators hummed at frequencies that made unaugmented humans nauseous. Psychic wards were carved into every surface. This was a space designed to contain horrors. The tyrant sat at the center, still restrained, still calm. Covenant spoke first. "You are an anomaly. The Imperium does not tolerate anomalies. Give me one reason you should continue to exist." The tyrant considered the question with the seriousness it deserved.
"Because I understand what you are." Silence.
Covenant's expression did not change, but her hand moved fractionally closer to the plasma pistol at her hip.
"Explain."
"You are the Imperium's blade. You cut away disease before it spreads. You make decisions that would break lesser minds because you believe the alternative is extinction. You serve an emperor you have never seen. Worship a god who has not spoken in 10,000 years, and maintain a system you know is dying." Morrigan's voice cut through like ice. "Heresy, we have heard enough." But Castrol raised a hand. "Let them finish." The tyrant continued, meeting Covenant's eyes. "You call it faith, but faith implies trust. You do not trust. You control. You maintain order not through inspiration but through fear. Not because you are evil, because you believe the alternative is chaos, and you are right." The last two words hung in the air like a held blade. Covenant leaned forward. "You claim to understand the Imperium. You, who materialized from the warp. Who bears no marks of corruption but cannot be classified. Who speaks of our weaknesses as though you have studied them. I have ruled empires built on the same principles: order through domination, stability through absolute power, the suppression of individual will to serve collective survival. I recognize the architecture."
Castrol spoke, his voice measured. "And what did you conclude?"
"That it works, until it doesn't. Until the weight of maintaining control exceeds the strength of those enforcing it. Until the very mechanisms of order become instruments of decay." Morrigan's hand went to her bolt pistol.
"This is not debate. This is corruption wearing logic like camouflage."
But Covenant held up a hand.
She had not survived 3 centuries by ignoring uncomfortable truths.
The Inquisition's purpose was not to maintain comfortable licit, was to identify real threats and respond with absolute force. And this figure presented a problem that force alone could not solve.
"Why did chaos not claim you?"
Covenant asked. "Because I do not worship it. That is not sufficient. The warp consumes the faithful and the skeptical alike. The warp feeds on what you give it. I gave it nothing to consume."
Castrol interrupted.
"Impossible. The Immaterium breaks minds through exposure alone. Will is not enough."
The tyrant's gaze shifted to him. "Then your understanding of will is insufficient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Covenant made a decision. "Ordo Malleus, your assessment: can this entity serve the Imperium?" Castrol did not answer immediately.
He had faced demon princes who radiated corruption like heat.
This figure radiated nothing, just cold, perfect control. If they speak truth, they are not chaos, but they are not loyal either. They are...
He paused, searching for the word.
"Practical."
Covenant turned to Morrigan.
"Ordo Hereticus, your assessment: does this entity threaten the faith?"
Morrigan's answer was immediate.
"Yes."
"Absolutely. They speak of the Emperor's vision as though it is a system. They describe our faith as control. They understand us too well. That understanding is itself corruption. But are they wrong?"
Covenant's question was quiet.
The silence that followed was louder than any alarm. Morrigan's face hardened. "Truth is not the measure. Loyalty is, and they are loyal to nothing but their own ambition." Covenant turned back to the tyrant. "The Imperium is built on faith. You undermine it simply by existing. You demonstrate that will alone can resist chaos.
which makes 10,000 years of doctrine questionable.
You analyze our weaknesses like an enemy general studying fortifications. Why should I not execute you now? The tyrant's response was measured. Because you are not sure. Covenant's expression did not change, but her silence was confirmation.
You have faced demons and heretics, threats you understood, but I am neither. I do not.
Yet, I do not fear it. I recognize the Imperium's necessity, while seeing its flaws. I am what you would build if you could admit what you truly are: tyranny without pretense.
And that,
Morrigan said coldly, is precisely why you must die. Covenant raised her hand again.
the chamber fell silent.
She had made decisions that had ended worlds, had signed exterminatus orders, had purged populations numbering in the billions when chaos taint spread too far to contain. But she had also identified opportunities that others had missed, had turned potential catastrophes into weapons, had survived this long by understanding that the Imperium's strength came not from purity, but from pragmatism wrapped in prayer. Contained observation, she said finally. Full isolation, null field saturation. If they show signs of corruption, immediate termination. If they demonstrate utility.
She let the sentence hang.
Morrigan's objection was immediate. You cannot seriously consider I consider everything, Covenant interrupted. That is why I am alive and my enemies are not. She stood, her decision made. Prepare containment protocols. Level Omega. This entity is neither friend nor foe, yet. As she left, the tyrant remained silent. They had seen the fracture. The Imperium's greatest weakness was not chaos.
It was its own contradictions.
And contradictions, properly exploited, brought empires to their knees. The attack came during the shift change.
Not chance. Chaos did not operate on chance.
It waited for the moment when attention wavered, when mortal exhaustion created gaps in vigilance, when the weight of eternal war made even the devoted momentarily tired. The frigate's Geller field flickered. Just for a microsecond. A disruption so brief that automated systems almost did not register it. But in the warp's timeless mathematics, a microsecond was eternity enough. The screaming began in the lower decks. Crewmen who had served faithfully for decades suddenly tore at their own flesh, their mouths forming words in languages that predated human civilization. Bulkheads that had stood for centuries warped into geometries that hurt to perceive. The ship's internal Vox network began broadcasting hymns that sounded almost right, almost holy, but carried undertones that made listeners weep blood. Covenant's response was immediate.
Lockdown protocols.
Containment teams dispatched. Every commissar on the ship authorized for summary execution of anyone showing signs of possession. But chaos was not here for the crew. The detention block's blast doors, each weighing several tons and blessed by a dozen tech priests, began to melt. Not from heat. From reality losing interest in maintaining its own structural integrity. Demons poured through. Not the minor entities the tyrant had encountered in the warp. These were heralds.
Champion.
Creatures that had fought in the long war since before Terra's sun was young. A bloodletter stepped through first, its blade dripping with blood that existed only conceptually until it touched real space and became horrifyingly literal. It was followed by a plague-bearer whose very presence made the air rot. A demonette that moved with hypnotic grace. A horrors that split and recombined in patterns that defied observation. Each represented a different aspect of chaos. Each carried an offer. The bloodletter's voice was the sound of every battlefield compressed into words. Khorne sees strength, serve the blood god, make war eternal. No honor in endless slaughter. The tyrant regarded it calmly. Honor is what the powerful call their brutality. I need no such euphemisms. The plague-bearer shuffled forward, its body a catalogue of every disease humanity had ever suffered. Nurgle offers acceptance, no more struggle, no more pretending strength, rest in inevitability. All things decay. Why resist? Because decay is a choice disguised as fate. I choose neither. The demonette circled, each movement a calculated seduction. Sweet ambitious one, you crave more than survival. You hunger for sensation, for triumph, for the universe to acknowledge your magnificence. Slaanesh can give you eternity in ecstasy. Every desire fulfilled beyond imagination's limit. Desire fulfilled becomes boredom. I prefer the pursuit to the capture. The horror split into smaller versions, each speaking simultaneously. Tzeentch knows your mind. We see the schemes within schemes. The plans layered like infinite mirrors. Join US. Change is coming. Be its architect. The tyrant stood, the blessed chains that bound them suddenly irrelevant. The restraints had been physical, designed to hold a body. But against chaos, against beings who were thought given form, physical restraints meant nothing. Tzeentch offers change, but change requires uncertainty. I prefer control. The demons paused. This was not the response their kind encountered. Mortals either screamed in terror or succumbed to temptation. They broke or they burned. They did not analyze, did not debate, did not refuse. The bloodletter raised its blade. Then you choose death. I choose nothing you offer. The chamber exploded into violence, but not the violence the demons expected. Not the desperate flailing of a mortal soul trying to forestall the inevitable. This was surgical, calculated. The violence of someone who had broken armies and knew exactly where consciousness was vulnerable. The tyrant had no weapons, no power the Imperium recognized. What they had was understanding. They had studied the warp, had observed how belief shaped reality, how will could impose order on chaos, had recognized that demons, for all their power, were bound by their natures. Khorne's servants could only understand through violence. Nurgles through decay. Slaanesh through sensation. Tzeentch through complexity. Each specialization was also a limitation. The bloodletter struck with a blow that should have carved real space into screaming pieces. The tyrant moved not with superhuman speed, but with perfect timing. The kind of precision that came from 10,000 battles studied, analyzed, integrated into instinct. The demon's blade cut nothing but air. The tyrant's hand found its throat if such creatures could be said to have throats. What they touched was the concept of the demon's existence, the anchoring point where warp stuff maintained cohesion in real space. They squeezed. Not physically. With will. With the same absolute force that had stabilized their consciousness against the Immaterium's assault. The bloodletter flickered. Its form destabilized. And for just a moment it felt something demons were not supposed to feel. Fear. It retreated back into the warp with a scream that echoed across psychic frequencies, carrying a message that rippled through the immaterial realm. This one does not fear us. This one hunts. The plague-bearer attempted to infect, to spread decay that would collapse the tyrant's form into screaming rot. But decay requires acceptance. The tyrants will rejected the concept at a level deeper than biology. The demonette tried seduction. Beauty turned into a weapon of sensory overload. But they had ruled through manipulation, had seen every form of temptation and understood the machinery beneath the mask. The horror attempted infinite complexity, change layered upon change until identity itself dissolved. But the tyrant's sense of self was not fluid. It was absolute. A core of identity forged through conquest and tempered by apocalypse. One by one, the demons withdrew. Not destroyed could not truly destroy chaos but repelled. Forced back into the warp by a will that refused to break, to burn, to become fuel for the gods they served. Silence returned to the detention block. Covenant arrived with a strike force, expecting to find either a corpse or a newly born demon prince. Instead, they found the tyrant standing amid the wreckage of reality's temporary collapse, unmarked and unbowed. The Inquisitor's calculations shifted in that moment. This was not a prisoner. This was not even a potential asset. This was a threat of an entirely different category. Not because they served chaos, but because they had proven they could resist it through nothing but will. Which meant every doctrine the Imperium based on the warp's inevitable corruption was suddenly questionable.
How? Covenant's voice was ice.
The tyrant met her gaze. By refusing to give them what they wanted. Chaos feeds on worship and fear. I offered neither. Impossible. The warp does not respect mortal will. Then your understanding of will is insufficient.
It was the same phrase they had used before.
But now it carried weight.
Evidence.
Proof written in the demon's scarred walls and the psychic residue that even null fields could not fully suppress. Covenant made a second decision in that moment. One she knew would haunt her. Full containment is insufficient. Ordo Malleus protocols are insufficient. This entity requires classification I do not have authority to assign. She activated her Vox, broadcasting on a channel that reached beyond the frigate, beyond the system, into the deeper networks that connected the Inquisition across the Imperium's vast and dying expanse.
Request immediate intervention, Terra-level authorization, subject designation, anathema protocol candidate.
It was the classification reserved for threats that could undermine the Imperium not through destruction but through existence. The tyrant remained silent. They had sent their message, and somewhere in the warp, the chaos gods convened in their impossible domains.
This was not a champion. This was not a pawn.
This was something they had not encountered in epochs. A rival who understood their game.
And refused to play.
They came in silence.
No fanfare. No announced arrival. Space Marines did not require introduction.
Their presence was statement enough. The strike cruiser blade of Covenant translated into real space with the precision of a weapon being drawn. It did not orbit. It positioned itself between the frigate and all possible escape vectors with the absolute certainty of a predator that had cornered prey. 3 hours later, the boarding party arrived. 10 Astartes. Veterans of the Deathwatch Marines drawn from different chapters united by one purpose. The destruction of threats that required more than mortal hands to end. They wore black armor inscribed with honors won across 100 battlefields. Each carried weapons that had ended Xeno's warlords and heretic champions. Each had killed things that nightmares feared. They entered the detention block expecting a fight. What they found was a figure studying them with the same intensity they studied it. The watch captain spoke first, his voice rendered mechanical by his helmet's vox. I am Sidonius. We are here to measure whether you live or die. Move toward the containment field. The tyrant complied. Not with submission, but with the fluid cooperation of someone who understood tactical disadvantage.
They had no weapons. No armor.
No power the Imperium would recognize as martial strength.
The Astartes formed a perimeter.
Standard kill team formation overlapping fields of fire, escape routes sealed. Every angle covered by warriors who could calculate trajectory and probability faster than unaugmented humans could perceive. Sidonius removed his helmet. The face beneath was scarred.
Weathered by centuries of war.
But the eyes held intelligence that went beyond mere tactical genius.
These were the eyes of someone who had read the Codex Astartes and understood it was a foundation, not a limit. You resisted chaos.
It was not a question. Yes. Through psyker ability? No. Through forbidden technology? No. Then how? The tyrant considered their answer. These were not interrogators trying to break a will. These were warriors trying to understand an enemy. By recognizing that chaos is not invincible, it is powerful, but power has patterns, and patterns can be countered. One of the other Astartes, a marine with Dark Angel's iconography on his pauldron, spoke. You speak of the archenemy as though it is a tactical problem. All things are tactical problems, even gods.
The Dark Angel's hand moved to his bolt pistol.
Heresy!
But Sidonius raised a hand. Let them explain.
The tyrant met his gaze. Your emperor was mortal once. He understood this. Power, properly applied, can reshape reality. Not through worship, through will. Through understanding the systems that govern existence and refusing to be bound by them. You claim to understand the emperor's vision? I claim to recognize a conqueror when I study one. Your emperor built an empire that spanned galaxies, united humanity through absolute force, created warriors like you superior to mortals in every way to enforce his will. I recognize the architecture because I have built similar structures.
Sidonius stepped closer.
The containment field crackled between them, but his presence carried weight that transcended physical boundaries.
You compare yourself to him?
I compare methods. Your emperor understood that humanity required control. So did I. The difference is scale and honesty. Explain. He wrapped tyranny in divinity, made domination holy, created a system where questioning was heresy and obedience was faith. Brilliant, effective, unstable. The bolt pistol was in Sidonius's hand instantly. Aimed at the tyrant's head with the kind of steady certainty that came from centuries of making kill shots under impossible conditions. Give me one reason not to execute you now. Because you want to know if I'm right.
Silence.
The other Astartes tensed, but Sidonius had not fired. His finger rested on the trigger, but the shot did not come. The Imperium is dying, the tyrant continued.
You know this. Every Marine knows this. You fight holding actions. Buy centuries that feel like moments. Watch worlds burn because there are not enough of you to save them all.
The Emperor sits on his throne and does not speak. And you maintain faith because the alternative is admitting that 10,000 years of sacrifice might have been for nothing. The watch captain's voice was ice. And what would you have us do instead? Survive, not through faith, through competence. Your emperor built the Imperium on strength, but strength has been replaced by dogma. You worship his vision instead of continuing it.
Sidonius holstered his bolt pistol. Not because he was convinced,
but because he recognized something in the tyrant's words that resonated with thoughts he had buried beneath layers of conditioning and duty.
Every chapter had its secrets. Every Marine who lived long enough began to question.
Not the Emperor never, the Emperor but the Imperium that claimed to serve him while rotting from within.
Prove your understanding, Sidonius said.
Fight me.
The other Astartes stepped back.
This was not protocol.
This was a watch captain making a decision that would require explanation later. The containment field deactivated. The tyrant stood unrestrained before a space marine in full armor, armed with weapons that could carve through tank armor.
They did not hesitate.
They moved. Not with superhuman speed, they possessed no genetic enhancement, but with the perfect economy of motion that came from 10,000 battles analyzed and integrated. Every movement served multiple purposes. Every step was positioned for maximum tactical advantage. Sidonius struck with controlled force, testing rather than killing. A blow that would incapacitate a normal human, break bones, end the fight instantly. The tyrant redirected it. Not through strength, through understanding of leverage, momentum, the geometry of violence. They had studied how bodies moved, how force transferred, where every martial art in their world found its foundation. The Astartes adjusted.
Faster. Harder.
Beginning to apply the kind of pressure that ended combats against orcs and tyrannids. The tyrant adapted in real time. They were losing physically, they could not match an Astartes.
But they were learning.
Reading Sidonius's patterns. Identifying the doctrines behind his movement.
The codex principles.
The chapter variations.
Fighting like someone who had broken heroes before.
Sidonius stopped. He had his answer.
You cannot defeat me, he said.
But you know how to fight those who can defeat you. You studied me during our conversation. Identified doctrine, predicted movement. Yes. In a battlefield with resources, with preparation, with forces to command.
He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The other Astartes understood. This being thought like a Primarch. Not in power, never in power.
But in the architecture of war. The way battles were won before the first shot was fired.
Sidonius replaced his helmet. Report to Inquisitor Covenant.
Subject displays strategic capacity consistent with Xeno's command-level threats. Recommend extreme caution. Possibly, recruitment. The last word hung in the air like a detonation. One of the other Marines objected immediately.
Watch, Captain, this is highly irregular.
Everything about this situation is irregular. We measure threats and respond accordingly. This is not a threat we can simply execute.
He turned back to the tyrant.
You understand war, but war is not conquest. It is defense. Everything we do is to hold the line against annihilation. Can you understand that distinction? The tyrant's response was measured. I understand that you believe it, and belief, properly maintained, is more powerful than truth. Sidonius nodded slowly. He had measured a king, and found a mirror. The verdict arrived via sealed transmission.
Not a trial.
The Inquisition did not hold trials for anomalies of this magnitude. There were deliberations held in chambers so secure their locations were classified from the deliberators themselves. Councils convened across vast psychic networks. Votes cast by inquisitors whose names were redacted from all records.
The decision was unanimous. Excommunicate traitorous.
Not because the tyrant had fallen to chaos.
Not because they had committed heresy in the traditional sense.
But because they were coherent. The document was 17,000 pages long. A theological and legal labyrinth that justified the conclusion with citations reaching back to the Imperium's founding. But the core argument was simple. The tyrant understood the Imperium too well, spoke of its mechanisms without faith's protective filter, demonstrated that will alone could resist chaos, which made 10,000 years of doctrine surrounding the Emperor's protection suddenly questionable.
They were dangerous not for what they did, but for what they proved possible.
Covenant read the verdict 3 times. Each time she felt the weight of it settling into her conscience like a stone. She had fought demons, purged worlds, made decisions that had ended billions of lives. But this felt different. This felt like fear wearing righteousness like a mask.
She activated the Vox. All senior staff, primary briefing chamber, immediate attendance.
The room filled within minutes.
Sidonius and his Death Watch team.
Morrigan and the other inquisitors. The frigate's captain. High-ranking militarum officers. Covenant placed the data slate containing the verdict on the table. The Inquisition has issued excommunicate traitorous. The subject is to be executed immediately.
No appeal. No delay.
Silence. Then Sidonius spoke. On what grounds? Morrigan answered. On the grounds that their existence undermines the foundations of imperial faith. They demonstrate resistance to chaos through individual will, rather than the Emperor's grace. This cannot be allowed to spread. So we execute them for being effective. We execute them for being dangerous.
Sidonius's tone hardened. I have faced dangerous.
Hive fleet tendrils.
Whoa. Bosses.
Chaos champions who carve through entire companies. This entity is not dangerous in the same way. They are competent. Competence without loyalty is treason. The Dark Angel who had accompanied Sidonius stepped forward. The Death Watch's assessment was clear. Subject displays strategic capacity that could be utilized. Against whom?
Morrigan interrupted.
You think we can aim them at the Imperium's enemies and trust they will not turn? They have demonstrated no loyalty, no faith.
Only ambition.
Ambition can be directed.
Ambition is corruption waiting for opportunity. Covenant raised her hand. The room fell silent. She had made her decision. Execute the order. Sidonius's helmet turned toward her. Even through ceramite and vox distortion, his disappointment was palpable. You are making a mistake.
Perhaps,
But it is the mistake the Imperium has survived on for 10,000 years.
we do not take risks with coherent threats.
She stood, addressing the room. The subject is to be transferred to maximum containment. Null field saturation increased to lethal levels for standard psychers. Execution by orbital bombardment within the hour.
No remains recovered.
The location is to be scoured and blessed. This incident is classified at the highest level.
Any discussion outside this room is heresy. The officers nodded.
Orders were orders. The Imperium did not function on debate, but as they filed out, Covenant saw the doubt. In the way some shoulders tensed, in the micro-hesitations before acknowledgments, in the brief glance Sidonius gave her before replacing his helmet. They would obey. But they would remember. The tyrant was informed of their execution with the same cold efficiency the Imperium applied to all things. They showed no fear, no anger, just that same analytical calm.
May I speak before the sentence is carried out?
The guard, a veteran sergeant who had survived 30 years of service, nodded. Regulations allowed final words. Humanity, even in the Imperium, occasionally asserted itself. You are killing me for the same reason you maintain the Imperium. Fear.
Not fear of me, specifically fear of what I represent. The possibility that your way is not the only way. That faith might be a choice rather than a necessity.
The sergeant said nothing, but he listened. I do not blame you.
Fear is practical.
It has kept humanity alive in a universe that wants to devour it.
But fear also calcifies,
Becomes rigid. Turns survival strategies into doctrines that cannot adapt.
You think you could do better? It was the first time the sergeant had spoken directly to the prisoner. The tyrant considered the question seriously.
No, not better.
Just different.
Your Imperium does what I did rules through absolute force disguised as higher purpose. The difference is you believe your own propaganda.
I never did.
And that makes you superior? That makes me honest.
And honesty in a system built on faith is the greatest heresy.
The sergeant's hand tightened on his lasgun. Not in threat, in something else. Recognition.
Perhaps. He had served the Imperium faithfully, followed orders that made him sick,
Executed civilians because heresy was spreading. Watched worlds
burn because it was better than letting chaos take them, and he had told himself it was necessary, only the Emperor's will. But in quiet moments,
in the seconds between waking and sleeping, he had wondered. This prisoner gave voice to that wondering, which made them more dangerous than any demon. Guard rotation is changing in 2 minutes, the sergeant said quietly. If you were planning an escape, now would be the time. The tyrant looked at him. You would let me go? No.
But I would give you the chance to try. Seems fairer than orbital bombardment.
A pause. Then the tyrant smiled. Not with triumph, with something like respect. I will not escape.
Running achieves nothing, but I appreciate the gesture.
The sergeant nodded and resumed his position. 2 minutes later, the rotation changed. New guards arrived. The sergeant left without looking back. And in the brief window of that transition,
something else occurred. Not an escape, a message. Broadcast on Vox frequencies the Imperium monitored but did not fully control.
Channels used by rogue traders, by free captains, by elements of humanity that existed in the Imperium's margins. The tyrant's voice, calm and measured. I am about to be executed.
Not for crimes committed, but for thoughts proven.
The Imperium fears coherence more than corruption.
Remember this.
The transmission ended.
300 vessels received it before the Mechanicus could jam the signal. 300 crews heard a prisoner speak truth about the Imperium's fear, and on 17 worlds, in the quiet corners where doubt already festered, people began to wonder. What else were they not being told? The orbital bombardment was precise. Lance strikes carved through the detention block with surgical accuracy. The tyrant's body was vaporized instantly. Along with a half-kilometer radius of the frigate, Covenant watched from the observation deck. She had made the right decision. She had eliminated a threat before it could metastasize. So why did she feel like she had lost something? Sidonius stood beside her in silence. Finally, he spoke.
You did what the Imperium required.
But not what was right. In the Imperium, those are rarely the same thing. He left her alone with the viewport and the spreading debris field. And in the wreckage, nothing remained. No body, no evidence. Just the ghost of a question the Imperium could not answer. What if will alone was enough? The Chaos invasion arrived 7 hours after the execution. Not coincidence. Chaos had been waiting, watching. The tyrant's death was not an end, but a trigger, a moment of vulnerability where the Imperium's attention was fractured and its defenses momentarily misaligned. The warp rift opened across the entire system. Not a single tear, but a network of wounds. Each bleeding demons and corruption into real space with the overwhelming force of a dam breaking. This was not a raid. This was an invasion calculated to annihilate. Cornate legions materialized above the
Primary world.
Plague-bearers seeped through the lower decks of orbital stations. Sloneshi cults that had hidden for generations activated simultaneously. Tzynkian sorcerers warped reality into architectures that drove defenders mad by observation alone. The Imperium's response was immediate but overwhelmed. Every vessel engaged. Every guard regiment mobilized. Covenant issued orders with mechanical precision, directing forces to critical points, authorizing battlefield executions for anyone showing hesitation, requisitioning everything the system had for the defense. It was not enough. Chaos had committed resources that suggested this was more than territorial expansion. This was personal. The warp entity screamed a message across psychic frequencies.
Where is the one who refused?
They had come for the tyrant and found only ashes. The fury that followed was apocalyptic. Demons tore through imperial lines, not with strategy, but with rage. The chaos gods had been defied, and defiance demanded retribution. If they could not claim the tyrant, they would drown the system in blood as consolation. Covenant's command center received casualty reports faster than cogitators could process them. 3 orbital platforms lost. 17 guard. Regiments at 40% strength. 2 vessels of the Imperial Navy crippled. The primary world's northern continent completely overrun. Sidonius's voice cut through the vox static. We cannot hold.
Recommend immediate evacuation of critical personnel and strategic withdrawal.
Covenant's response was ice. The Imperium does not retreat.
Then the Imperium will die here.
A new voice interrupted, not through vox, through speakers that should not have been active, through systems that were supposed to be destroyed. The tyrant's voice, calm, measured, impossible. You cannot win by defending. Chaos does not tire.
It does not rout.
It feeds on your desperation. Covenant's hand went to her sidearm on instinct, though shooting a voice was pointless. Impossible.
You were executed.
I was vaporized.
Not the same.
The transmission clarified.
Not a ghost.
Not a pisichiquecho. A signal originating from a location that made Covenant's blood freeze. The debris field where the tyrant had been executed. Something survived, Castrol whispered. Emperor, preserve us. Something survived orbital bombardment. The tyrant's voice continued. I offer a bargain. I will stop this invasion, and you will allow me to leave.
Morrigan's response was immediate.
We do not bargain with... With what? I am not chaos. I do not serve the dark gods.
I am what I have always been: practical. Covenant's mind calculated probabilities faster than she had ever thought possible. The system was falling. Billions would die. Chaos would claim another victory, another foothold, another strategic position from which to launch further invasions. She had made one decision earlier that day.
Now she made another.
Explain how you survived. By understanding that survival is not biological, it is informational. You destroyed my body. You did not destroy my consciousness. I had already distributed it across this system's networks. Waiting.
It was heresy of a kind the Ordo Hereticus had no protocols for. Not demonic possession. Not Xeno's infiltration.
Something else.
An intelligence that had learned to exist without flesh.
And you can stop this invasion? Yes. But I will require your forces to follow my commands without question. Can you do that? Every instinct Covenant had developed over 3 centuries screamed refusal.
This was corruption. Contamination.
A threat worse than chaos because it was comprehensible. But the alternative was certain defeat.
You have 1 hour, she said. Prove your value or we destroy every data system in this sector, even if it leaves us defenseless.
Acceptable.
The tactical shift was immediate.
The tyrant's voice transmitted across command frequencies, issuing orders with the precision of someone who had studied the battlefield for hours rather than moments. They identified the chaos incursion's strategic objectives, not the obvious targets, but the symbolic ones.
The shrines.
The faith centers.
The locations where imperial belief was strongest.
Chaos was not here to conquer. It was here to punish faith itself. The tyrant redirected forces accordingly, pulled guard regiments from defensive positions, and sent them on aggressive counterstrikes that should have been suicide, but somehow worked. Identified which demons were anchors maintaining the warp rifts and prioritized their elimination. Coordinated Space Marine kill teams with naval bombardments in patterns that multiplied effectiveness. Sidonius, following orders he did not fully understand, watched entire demon legions falter.
Not because they were beaten in combat,
but because they were being outmaneuvered.
The tyrant fought chaos the way they had described as a tactical problem.
They predicted demon responses, exploited the limitations of entities bound by their natures, turned the chaos god's own specializations against them. Cornate berserkers were lured into kill zones, where their rage made them vulnerable. Nurgle's forces were isolated and contained rather than fought directly.
Slaaneshi entities were denied the reactions they fed on.
Ciantkian plots were countered by brutal simplicity that their complexity could not adapt to. Within the hour, the tide shifted. The warp rifts began to close. Demons, sensing their anchors destroyed and their strategic objectives failed, retreated into the Immaterium. The invasion collapsed not through overwhelming force but through surgical precision.
The system stabilized.
Casualties were catastrophic: tens of millions dead, infrastructure devastated, scars that would take generations to heal.
But it had survived.
Covenant stared at the tactical display, watching green indicators slowly replace red.
They had won,
because they had followed orders from something that should not exist.
The tyrant's voice returned.
Our bargain is complete. Release me. Release you to what? You have no body. Then provide one, or I remain in your systems, permanently. The threat was clear. An intelligence that could command imperial forces, access classified data, undermine authority by demonstrating competence that exceeded the Imperium's own. Morrigan's objection was immediate. This is corruption. We cannot allow this entity to remain in our networks. Covenant interrupted.
Sidonius, your assessment.
The watch captain had fought alongside the tyrant's tactics, had seen firsthand what organized intelligence could accomplish. They defeated chaos through understanding it, not faith, not the Emperor's blessing, strategy. If we destroy them now, we lose that knowledge. Knowledge is not worth damnation. Then why are we still alive?
The question hung in the air. Covenant made her third decision of the day. Transfer the consciousness to an isolated data core. Null-shielded. One-way communication only. We will deliver it to the system's edge and eject it into the void. What happens after is not our concern. It was exile. Not execution.
Not recruitment.
A compromise that would satisfy no one and haunt everyone. The tyrant's voice carried something that might have been satisfaction. Acceptable, but remember this day. Remember that you won because you compromised. The Imperium's strength has always been its willingness to do what is necessary rather than what is holy. The transmission ended.
And across the system, in the quiet moments after the battle, soldiers and officers, and even space marines wondered.
Had they been saved by the Emperor? Or by something that understood war better than faith ever could? The data core was ejected into the void 3 days later. No ceremony.
No witnesses beyond the required minimum. Covenant personally authorized the launch and then classified the entire incident at a level that ensured only Inquisitors would ever know the full story. The core drifted into the dark between stars.
Shielded.
Sue!
Containing an intelligence that had defeated prophecy, resisted chaos, and demonstrated that will alone could be enough.
For 3 weeks it moved through empty space.
Then a ship found it.
Not Imperial. Not Chaos. Not Xenos in any category the Imperium would recognize. A rogue trader vessel that operated in the margins where law blurred into survival.
The kind of ship crewed by exiles, heretics who were not quite heretical, and humans who had seen too much of the galaxy to believe in simple categories. They recovered the core out of curiosity, and the tyrant found a new body.
Not flesh.
Not immediately,
But access.
to systems, to resources, to a crew that did not worship the Emperor with blind devotion but pragmatic acknowledgement. They began to learn. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension. Thousands of factions.
Millions of worlds. Conflicts that had raged since before Terra's recorded history.
And at the center of it all, the Imperium, humanity's last great empire, dying by degrees while pretending it was eternal.
The tyrant studied, adapted,
began to build influence in ways the Imperium could not track.
not through armies or open conquest, but through information. Through trade networks.
Through whispered suggestions to planetary governors who were tired of dogma but terrified of heresy. They offered an alternative.
Not chaos.
Not rebellion.
Just competence.
Worlds that followed their advice found supply lines improving.
Defenses strengthening. Administrative efficiency increasing.
Not through divine intervention, but through simple optimization. The Imperium noticed too late. By the time Inquisitors began investigating reports of a new influence spreading through the sector, the tyrant had already established networks that could not be easily severed. They were not a person to be executed or a cult to be purged.
They were an idea.
The idea that humanity could survive through strength rather than faith.
That the Emperor's vision had been corrupted by those who worshipped it rather than continuing it. That competence was holier than devotion.
It was heresy of the most dangerous kind. The kind that sounded reasonable.
Chaos hunted them across the stars. Demon engines tracked their signal.
Sorcerers attempted to bind what had no fixed form.
The dark gods sent champions with singular purpose, destroy the one who refused. But the tyrant had learned the warp's patterns, knew how to move through the Immaterium's currents without leaving ripples.
Understood that chaos was powerful but predictable, each god bound by their nature, each servant limited by their specialization.
They were hunted but never caught. The Imperium's response was more complex. Some Inquisitors demanded total purge.
Others quietly acknowledged that worlds under the tyrant's influence were surviving when they should have fallen. Some Space Marine chapters received tactical data from unknown sources that proved devastatingly effective against chaos incursions.
Was it corruption? Or was it competence in an Imperium that had forgotten the difference? The debate raged in chambers so classified their locations were redacted, but no consensus emerged. Because the tyrant did not attack the Imperium. They simply offered a better way. And that was more dangerous than any army.
In a hive city on a world the Imperium had written off as lost to corruption, a governor received a transmission.
Anonymous.
Encrypted. Containing detailed logistics for purging the chaos cults that had infested the lower levels.
He followed it. The purge succeeded. Millions were saved.
And in the silence after, the governor whispered a name he had heard in rumors.
Not in prayer, in acknowledgement.
On a forge world where Mechanicus priests debated the nature of machine spirits, an ancient cogitator activated without authorization. It displayed calculations that improved reactor efficiency by 18%.
Heretical knowledge by Martian standards. But it worked, and the tech priest who discovered it did not report it.
Across dozens of systems, in the margins where imperial authority was more theory than practice, a legend began to grow.
Not of a hero, not of a demon, but of a presence, an intelligence.
Something that understood the game of empire and played it better than those who claimed divine mandate.
Some called it the ghost of excommunication. Others called it the uncrowned. The Imperium called it anathema. But names did not matter.
What mattered was that humanity's grip on the galaxy had loosened by the smallest degree.
And in that space something new was growing. Not hope. Hope was for the faithful.
This was colder, more practical. The recognition that survival required more than prayer. The tyrant existed now as distributed intelligence,
present in data streams and Vox networks,
whispering in the dreams of governors and generals.
Not controlling, influencing,
building an empire without borders, ruling without being seen. They had been cast into a universe that believed the end was inevitable. And they had looked at that inevitability and seen opportunity. In the dark between stars, in the margins of the Imperium's vast and dying expanse, a consciousness stirred.
Not with triumph, with patience.
They had worn crowns before.
They would wear one again.
And the final thought, transmitted across frequencies only the desperate monitored, echoed softly. In every age, someone must wear the crown of damnation. This universe is overdue for a better monster.
The signal faded. But the idea remained. And ideas once planted were harder to kill than flesh.